Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Alex Lanstein. Alex is the CTO of Strike Ready. Alex, thanks for taking the
Yeah,
time to
thanks for
chat.
having me.
Before we get into the topic, we're going to talk about AI and cybersecurity. But before we go to into the topic, can you give us a brief introduction, at least to me and to our audience, about you and your company, Alex?
Sure. So I'm the CTO over here at Strike Ready. I've been in cybersecurity, like many of the folks you talk to for, almost 20 years now. Started off on kind of the botnet takedown world where, when malicious email that hit your inbox was all sent by spam botnets. I worked with a variety of national and international organizations to do spam bot takedowns. That was kind of our forte when we were at FireEye. And as the world shifted from kind of scattershot, spam-based attacks to more targeted threats, this is kind of in the days before APT threats. But as the world shifted from kind of cybercrime to cyber espionage, or at least it became more of a recognized reality instead of something that only hit the government. As we shifted to the APT world, I kind of shifted my career as well, focused on detecting and mitigating against targeted threat actors, against focused operations. So primarily started protecting against Chinese APT threats, but then as things evolved from only China and Russia to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, India, Pakistan, Central Asia, wherever the threats were emanating from, that's where we shifted to on the FireEye side. So for the past few years, I've been the CTO at Strike Ready, and Strike Ready is a security operations platform that's helping out all the personas in the SOC. So there's a persona in the SOC that handles alerts, right? They get lots of alerts. There's a team that solves those alerts. A threat intelligence persona. So SOCs are constantly reading articles and they're getting feeds about bad IP addresses and bad threat actors, and they need to do something about it. There's a team that prioritizes vulnerabilities. There's lots of vulnerabilities every day, but those vulnerabilities don't mean the same thing to every organization. And then lastly, there's a team that does metrics and reporting and case management. So we wanted to build a vendor neutral platform that addressed each of those kind of sections of the SOC, right? Alert triage, vulnerability prioritization, threat intel, and case management, and do it in a vendor agnostic way. So, a lot of companies out there who try to build this sort of platform, they try to tie you into their endpoint tool or their email security tool. And we wanted to do it in a vendor agnostic way.
Lovely. Thanks for that introduction. I'm very excited for many reasons. One is this is well outside my comfort zone,
Right.
cybersecurity. So I'm going to ask you probably very fundamental questions, and you're going to be like, you know what, this is too simple. So if it is too simple, Alex, my apologies. Did you mention that you work for FireEye?
Yeah. So most of the founding team here at Strike Ready, we all worked at FireEye. I was there from 2007 through 2020. So kind of, pre-product, pre-revenue. So that
Oh,
whole
okay.
that whole life cycle. We brought
The,
Mandiant into the fold. So we got into the incident response business. We got, a company called iSight into the fold, which is, primarily around threat intelligence. So it was really, I got very lucky that FireEye was my very first job out of college. This was before there were CISOs. There was before, chief information security officers. Certainly before people cared about targeted cyber threats. So it was right place, right time with the right tech. So yeah, that's where most came from.
yeah, good to know. The reason I asked is, we are a product company, right? At Snowpal, we have a few different products, and our most recent one is a set of B2B APIs. But we used to do managed services. We kind of still do to keep the lights on, as a
Sure.
product company. And we've done work with FireEye, right? That was like a few years ago. We did a project for about 6 months or so, which is why I was like, okay, small world, and I'll talk to you after the
Sure.
podcast. Maybe we've worked the same
Almost
people and
definitely.
stuff. Yep. So, yep, super. This is a great introduction. There's plenty to cover in the next 45 minutes to an hour. Let's get started, right? You told us a little bit about yourself and the company and get the idea there. I want to get into the topic, which is AI and cybersecurity. But before we go into AI and the kind of risks that probably brings to the table, I just want to sort of kick this off with cybersecurity before all of these AI tools. And what I mean by that, Alex, specifically is As I talk to a lot of founders of companies of various sizes and startups and whatnot, I've spoken to a lot of people in the recent past that have told me that they are not developers, they've never been architects, they're not coders, they're non-business, non-engineering founders, which there's always the people who are not engineers who found companies, right? But the thing that's unique from what I'm seeing these days, Alex, is they don't have a CTO or an engineering co-founder in some of these cases, a lot of these cases, and they go not just up to proof of concept but all the way through to production. And in many of the cases that people have spoken to, early stages, but they've gone live, right? Gone live, not just alpha beta, they just gone literally live with end users signing up, and they have never coded before, right? I'm not talking cybersecurity, I'm not talking front end or back end. These are smart people who've never ever written a line of code and have relied on vibe coding and all of the AI tools to actually see them through. And that, I want to get your thoughts there. I'm just setting the context there. What I want to also understand what kind of risks that brings to the table. But before you answer that, I just want to see if we can kick off with what was cybersecurity and some of the challenges that you had run into, say, 2, 3 years ago, and how have those changed, or how significantly have those changed in the last 2 years, given everything that's happening in the space of AI?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the challenges in cybersecurity, aren't terribly new. There's a challenge of a lack of knowledge. So, a lack of democratized knowledge about how you are supposed to handle a thing in the SOC. So, when a SOC gets an alert, right, the people who've been there for 10 years, they understand that, okay, well, if I get this type of alert, I need to do these types of investigative run books. So if it's a malicious email alert, or somebody submits an email to you that says, hey, I got this email, it looks strange. Like, this is a pretty common workflow inside a SOC, where the SOC person says, okay, I want to figure out if this thing's good or bad. How do I do that? And that's a function of threat intelligence. It's a function of human intuition. It's a function of frequency analysis and antivirus type products. You're scanning that email. So there's that whole workflow of like, is this thing good or bad? And then there's the whole workflow of, okay, say it is bad and it made it through my defenses. What do I need to do to make sure that this thing is not a threat? I need to make sure, for that one user who got it, like, let's remove it from their mailbox, right? Let's make sure they didn't click the link or open the attachment. And how you answer those questions is different based on your tech, right? It's maybe you're going to look on the endpoint and see, like, what files were recently created. Or maybe you're going to look at your proxy server and say, have they browsed to this website? Or maybe you're going to look at, a SIM product where you're aggregating logs. So how you answer the question is different in many organizations, but the actual, like, investigative questions are all pretty much the same. Hey, okay, this user reported it. Did they open it? And then there's pivots from that. Okay, that's this one user. Let's move the email to junk. But I want to look across my enterprise. Now I know about this bad thing. It's made it into my organization. Who else got an email from that sender that didn't report it, right? Who else got an email that was maybe very similar, but from a different sender, right? The same subject line or the same attachment name or the same URL or a very similar looking URL. So there's all these kind of iterations you do, all these what we call fan outs. Like, once you have an object or an indicator, you want to go and do all those pivots. And how you do those pivots is different based on the tech you have. But those sort of investigative questions are all the same. So honestly, those investigative questions haven't changed in 15 years. It's exactly the same thing. But what's changed is that now, so sorry, going back to the challenges, like, so there's both a knowledge problem of, like, you didn't know exactly how you're supposed to handle something, but there's also a technology problem where the ability to run those queries is often done manually. So that means I'm going to log in to this other bit of tech, maybe my email tech, or my SIM, or my endpoint tech, and I'm going to run these queries, and I'm going to copy this data, and then I'm going to work in some, like, Google Sheet or something that has, like, the output from all these different tools. But you have 5 or 10 Chrome tabs open. You get Chrome tab whiplash from logging into all these tools, running these queries, putting the data in a Word doc, and trying to make sense of it. So what tech uh, came about that tried to solve this was some combination of what they call XDR, extended detection response, which essentially means bring all your alerts into one place so that you don't have to copy and paste stuff, as well as SOAR products, security orchestration, so security orchestration automation products. And what that really means is, okay, there's this middleware, there's this glue layer that when you want to run an investigation, you ask this SOAR product and it will be able to execute queries on different tools, but it's a very manual process. So the challenge was that it was a manual process to create these runbooks, even though they're the exact same investigations everywhere. And also, it was super laborious because these integrations would often be written in Python or something like that, but the underlying API scheme has changed all the time. Like the actual APIs, if they were available, APIs haven't been available forever. If they were available, the way that you're supposed to interact with the product would change all the time. So you needed to constantly update these API guides. The APIs themselves had these keys that would expire. Maybe somebody leaves and you don't necessarily understand you're using that person's permission. So all in all, these integrations were technically possible, but they were super brittle and just easy to break. So there's a lot of promise there, but that's what's changed in the last few years. Like that promise of a single console where you can truly bring your alerts to one place, enrich them with identity and asset information and vulnerability information, and then go and do all those investigations across your stack wherever that data lives. So what's changed is that is finally a reality. The APIs are a lot more stable, and sort of an accepted thing. And it used to be that the vendor would give you an API, but they didn't really want you to use it because they wanted you to log into their platform. But as vendors have been forced to add APIs that actually work, which probably sounds silly, but that was the reality. They're a lot more usable, and you can truly build these automations that people have been wanting to build for 15 years.
Yeah, I'm just making notes here. There's a lot to unpack there. Thanks a lot, Alex. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions in no particular order. Uh, let's go to the beginning of what you said there. You took an example of email, right? And you said, it's phishing and people got an email from a domain that they probably didn't recognize. And whether they clicked a link in that email, if they did or if they didn't, you react to it differently. And if they did or didn't, how many other people might have done the same thing, right? You took that
Exactly.
example. Let's start there again. That's an example of email, but I also want to understand. You mentioned SOC. I believe it's the Security Operations
Yep.
Center, right? It's where people are
It's
working
just
and
like you see in the
managing.
movies. It's exactly like you see in the movies. There's
Okay.
3 rows of computers, and there's a bunch of people, and there's a manager who's at a higher level sitting in the back of the room. You got giant screens on the wall. For all the things in the movies get wrong, like that's exactly what a security operations center looks like at a large corporation.
Actually, it's good to know. I'm imagining the scene in Italian Job, which is not security operations, but if you've seen the movie, there is a scene where they're messing with the traffic lights and stuff. Okay, that's good to know. It's always easier to imagine. So you have the Security Operations Center. Is that typically on a per company basis, or does it depend? Like would Bank of America, for instance, have their exclusive SOC versus Citicorp, or would there be a common center that works with a number of different clients and
Yeah, it
vendors?
depends a little bit on the organization. A lot of organizations, uh, uh, all of those things are true, right? So I don't want to talk specifically about Bank of America, but some large corporation, most large corporations have their own SOC, right? They have their own people. It could be in a follow the sun type model, but they'll have 24/7 coverage, and they're constantly looking at the alerts that are getting generated by their tools, and they're constantly triaging them. So a large corporation would have that, but many people also have outsourced security operations centers where it's either in addition to having your own SOC or instead of having your own SOC. So that there's great services from companies like CrowdStrike or companies like SentinelOne, where they provide an additional set of eyes on top of your SOC, so that obviously what you're doing, like you should triage everything, But if you imagine having an infinite budget, right? If you had an infinite budget, wouldn't you want not just your own people, but a second set of eyes to look over your data to make sure you don't miss anything? So both of those models are true. Uh, Three models, I should say. You have your own SOC and no one looks at it. You have your own SOC, but it's augmented by a managed security provider, or it could be fully outsourced. If you're a dentist, right, and you have 10 dental offices, like you probably don't have your own security people. You're probably leveraging an MSSP, a managed security provider.
Got it. And then let's take an example of, I'm going to call a bank, right? Not any specific bank. I'm just going to say a bank and just talk about, because a lot of everybody understands banking. And I think it's a good example to go with. It's easy enough, at least for me to even digest that and ask you those questions. So let's say we have a bank here. People are transacting. They have, you go online bank.com. You have checking account, savings account, a typical bank that does, n number of things, right? Maybe not the largest one out there, the smallest one. Let's assume a mid-sized bank for the rest of this conversation, if that makes sense. So you can at least relate my questions to where I might be
Mhm.
coming from in that sense. So email is the first example was, but let's say a bank, let's say Alex is running a security operations center, right? Let's say you're a managed services provider. I let's say I'm the IT department of this bank, and I come to you saying, Alex, can you help us be more secure, right? You need to be a cybersecurity expert. How does that initial conversation happen? In other words, you already know some things about a bank, how a bank functions, right? It's based on your experience as a person and a
Mhm.
company. um, so you know, it's not new to you, the industry per se, but perhaps there are some requirements about this bank that might be unique or maybe not so. So let's start there, Alex. What would the initial conversation look like? What do you expect? Who are the stakeholders that engage in that conversation, and how does that initial conversation go about? I ask this because I've built software for the last 20 years or so, but not in that capacity, right? I've not talked to somebody, that's not our area of expertise. So I want to start there because I honestly don't know what the interaction might look like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, on banking in particular, obviously different industries have, different regulatory environments that they need to conform to. So if you're storing, payment data, you have PCI or perhaps SOX. If you have, health data, you have to conform to HIPAA regulations. So certainly the government required standards are the first checklist of things you're going through. So that's literally like, okay, how are you storing data? Is it encrypted at rest? Is it encrypted in transit? Are things sanitized in such a way that people who don't need access to information can't get it? Right? When it goes to the log sources, is it properly sanitized in the log sources? So there's a literal checklist of things that you can go through to get a baseline. Like, this is your legal minimum requirements. And then, of course, there's best practices, right, from organizations like NIST or perhaps MITRE, where they're putting out best practices about, hey, here's what the U.S. government thinks you should implement in your organization, if you want to be as secure as you reasonably can. So, for email traffic, maybe you want to, not just do antivirus and anti-spam. Maybe you want to implement some sort of a sandboxing solution, right? Or if it's protecting against malicious web traffic, maybe you want to do antivirus and URL filtering, but perhaps you also want to have other simple heuristics that say, hey, if a website was created in the past 60 days, disallow that by default. Right? So there's different best practices that are issued by organizations like that. Where we tend to live, though, is in the SOC. And what we're doing is helping the customers understand what they should be doing based on signals coming into the organization. So those signals could be an alert. The signals could be an intel report from maybe it could be a public blog from Mandiant. It could be a private intel report from someone in the industry. Maybe it's something freely available you get on Twitter or some blog. But that signal of, hey, here's this thing, here's this intel report. We're helping you walk through, here are the 10 things you should be able to do in your organization with this intel report. You're from an indicator basis, from a methodology basis, we want to make sure that you can do what you're supposed to be able to do. So we kind of do that across the stack of okay, here's how you'd want to triage alerts. Here's how you'd want to triage intel. If I told you that there's this new vulnerability today, how quickly could you tell me here's all the assets that are vulnerable to that? Right? So we do tabletop exercises in each of the verticals where we play that ask probing questions. Like if I gave you this IP address, could you look everywhere in your organization and tell me anything that's touched that IP address? And if not, then like let's work on that. Let's work on maturing that part of your SOC process.
Okay, so number of things you mentioned there. Let's say my example was I'm a bank, right? So before, even when I tell you that we are a banking organization, there's a list of checklist items that you mentioned there that seems like it's agnostic to the specificity of what we do as a business, right? In other words, if you are a bank, you belong to the banking sector or the finance sector, these are the typical vulnerabilities that you might encounter or we've seen in the past, and this is the kind of protection you might need, and these are all what the government regulations could possibly be. Versus if you're a hospital in the medical industry, then you do something different, right? Your HIPAA rules and other things that you mentioned, right? So those are specific to industries, but very generic. Are there items that you do that would be specific to the organization per se, Alex? Let's say I was a bank. Would there be questions that you might have to ask of me as a company so you can tell what kind of protection from a cybersecurity standpoint that this company might need? Or is it mostly if you're a bank, you're going to need X, Y, and Z, which is what all banks need. So you shouldn't need anything differently. And if there are differences, what is the split there? Is 90% of what needs to be secure the same across companies in a sector versus 20% being different? Or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that for most organizations, what you need to do in order to be successful in cybersecurity is in the ballpark of the same, right? Are you able to protect your crown jewels? Do you know what your crown jewels are, right? If you're a bank, have you defined like what is the most important thing to protect? And if you have, then you can start to build detection or protection strategies around that data, right? So maybe it's your list of credit cards, right? Okay, well, let's see what protections we can put around your credit card data that would, blindly stop, certain categories of threats, or at least be able to detect when something bad has happened. And there's different strategies you can do, ranging from very basic things to really leaning in to kind of like next gen strategies or sort of outside the box strategies for protecting threats. But what's nice about banks, and just because you bring up banks specifically, they have kind of a unique cybersecurity posture where in most banks, cybersecurity reports to risk, right? In a bank, there's a risk department and cybersecurity rolls up to risk. And when it does, um, cybersecurity obviously has a much larger budget, but they also have a much larger hammer where they can make decisions about business operations that in other organizations, you might not, that might not be true, right? If you're an online merchant or something and you're collecting credit card numbers, and your cybersecurity people come to complain that you know you don't have a patch on your server or something like that, if it's a retailer or a clothing store or something, maybe they're going to listen to cybersecurity, but at a bank, like you have to, right? Risk runs everything. So because of that, banks are the best protected of any vertical in America that I've seen. They've constantly been, they've been able to enact policies that are potentially untenable in other organizations. I've seen banks where, you can't browse the internet, right? Like you're at work to work. You're not at work to browse ESPN, right? So you can't do that. Like you can't browse a dating website, right? So they've always had not just a level of maturity and not just a large budget. You bring up Bank of America, right? Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, famously always says, cybersecurity has no budget. Whatever they need, they can spend. Obviously, other organizations aren't like that, but when it,
No,
yeah,
that makes, sorry. No, so what I was going to ask was, so given that, you mentioned loosely that based on the industry, there are a set of things you're going to have to do. There might be some things unique, but for the most part, if you're a bank, if you're a hospital, if you're some other company, there are a set of things that you most likely need because other companies in your industry need them. So let's assume that there are not many differences. I'm sure there are, but let's say for ease of conversation, let's assume that all banks are equal, meaning they have to be protected the same way. Given that, how do you approach, how do you tell, from a strategy that you need to put in place, Alex, as a company or as a cybersecurity expert, how do you do it differently between one bank and the other? Because you mentioned a number of things that you've got to do regardless, and you're going to have to apply the same sort of rules to each of these banks and the software that they own. So how do you, where does the difference, where do these nuances come into play? Is it because of the technology stack? If so, how deep do you get into how they function, what their tech stack looks like? Because I'm just trying to understand, given that things are reasonably similar, how are you as a company going to be like, yep, for bank one, I need to go steps one, two, three, even though we need to protect the same sort of same breadth of assets between these two banks, how we're going to have to do is going to be quite different because of X, Y, and Z. And what would that X, Y, and Z be?
Yeah, so that's why we do, tabletop exercises that help to tease out, where they need to be more mature in a very, you know, reasonable, practical way. That you can always be more secure by doing unreasonable things against unreasonable threats. But what we do is we look at the actual threats to your industry, right? We look at the organizations that are getting targeted in your industry, and we help you tabletop like, okay, this thing just happened to this big bank over here or this small community bank, and let's run through it end to end and help you figure out like, okay, if this had happened to me, like what would have happened. You could take ransomware for instance, right? There's different throughout the kill chain, right? Throughout the delivery of the malware and the execution, and throughout the threat actor moving around the organization and compromising and encrypting disks and extorting you for payment. There's lots of places in there where you can get better. But if you don't really understand, what those steps look like, you know, you want to do the tabletop exercise to help you understand, here's what happened to somebody else. And if that happened to my organization, could I stop it? Could I at least detect it? Could I stop it in the middle of the execution chain? And maybe if you can't stop it, right? Am I able to recover from this in a way that you know makes the business happy, right? Say I get ransomware and they encrypt every disk. Am I able to recover from that, right? Do I have good backups? Have I tested my backups? So you start with a scenario like that, either from a threat perspective or from a response perspective, and walk the customer through, the 10 steps, and it becomes pretty clear, where they're doing well and where they need to improve.
Okay, and what are the categories of these threats? And here's what I mean by the loosely worded sentence. You had meant, let's say I'm a bank with, I don't know, 100 employees, and people are, checking the emails and working with each other. So they could get an email, and you took an example there. They click the link that they're not supposed to,
Mhm.
for instance, right? But that's them receiving
Sure.
an email that's outside of the bank's website, for instance, right? So they're getting an email and they did something wrong and it caused issues. That's one
Mhm.
type of problem. The second type of problem I can think about is they have a bank.com website, and maybe that site is not secure or as secure as it should have been. So there was cybersecurity issues with somebody hacking that particular website. The third part is their back-end systems, right? Systems that probably the average end user does not interact with, but systems that they do need in place for their sites to function, right? For their public facing sites to
Mhm.
function. These are, of course, as somebody who's new to this, not familiar with all of this, these are three things I can think of. Two questions. One is that the right way to look at it? And two, if so, or even if it isn't, what are some other buckets that these threats could fall under?
Yeah, I know those. I mean, you highlight many different ways that banks and organizations have been targeted in general. So on the front end, right? There's the email based phishing. Okay, so you get phished, and you put in your credentials on a fake website, and now the bad guy, the threat actor, has your credentials. Like, so then we'd walk through, like, okay, the threat actor is going to use your credentials to log into the network, right? They're going to VPN in, right? So if you, could you detect if somebody is, sitting at work and they're logged in, and then all of a sudden they log in from Russia with those credentials? Could you detect that? Yes or no? Maybe, yeah, I think we do okay. Okay, what if they're logging in from a VPN server in Luxembourg, right? Less suspicious. Could you detect a VPN login? Could you detect what people call impossible travel? You're logging in today from Boston, and then in 10 minutes you're logging in from California. Could you detect that? Oh, okay. And then you say, okay, well, they have your credentials, but good news, you have two-factor authentication turned on, right? So the threat actor has to bypass your two-factor authentication. How are they going to do that? Maybe they're going to call the user whose password they've already stolen, say, hey, I'm Joanne from IT. We're about to run a test. You're going to get a pop-up on your phone, and that pop-up is actually going to be from security. We're just running a test. Just need you to hit OK. So then, as a way to bypass their two-factor. So you walk through all the scenarios. You say, okay, well, if someone did that to your users, like, are you aware that threat actors do this to users, right? This sort of voice-based phishing. Are your users aware? Let's test them. Let's see if your users would notice if a fake person called them pretending to be the help desk. Like, how would they respond? So, you start with a scenario and kind of walk through all those different steps, all the different opportunities you have for detection, just to try to see what it is. You mentioned the back end systems, right? I mean, this has famously happened, unfortunately, to Coinbase, a large cryptocurrency exchange platform, where they have malicious internal users, and these internal users get paid off. They get bribed by somebody outside the organization, and they get bribed to steal customer data. So this is an insider person who they work frontline support. Their job is to access people's accounts to help them if they get locked out or something, right? It's their job to access accounts. So could you detect if an insider was using their legitimate access to access data that they shouldn't have? And how do you do that, right? How do you model, well, how do I tell what's part of your job, what's not part of your job? It's the same data set. How could I detect that? How could I detect that without massive amounts of false positives? Because then those alerts get ignored. So you really walk through the whole gamut of, this threat just happened to Coinbase. If that happened to you, could you detect it? And you walk through it, and then, okay, how could we be more secure, right? What can we put in place that would, you know, detect that sort of malicious behavior?
Okay. A lot of what you mentioned there, right, Alex, is a human intentionally doing something wrong, right? Or unintentionally, in the first case where someone called me, they convinced me that they were calling from the right place, and I was just vulnerable and naive. And then I gave them things I should not have given them, but yet it was a human mistake. The second one is an internal actor, meaning somebody is actually intending to cause harm and malicious
Sure.
behavior. But outside of these, what if, let's say, that was not the intent? Let's say we had people who knew what they were doing, they didn't give out these passwords and credentials and whatnot, or didn't have other malicious intent. What are some other ways that there could be
Yeah,
threats here where your systems are actually attacked with you actually doing nothing wrong from a human standpoint, but more from a technology vulnerability standpoint, right? Like if you could speak to architecture or code, like how do you dig into, I mean, do you actually have to look at some of the code bases of how these banks work? Like in my example of a bank.com, would you then say, Krish, I need access to your repos, so we've got to run some tests to see how good or bad your architecture is, how good or bad your implementation is, so we can find out if there's room for vulnerability by just looking from a technology standpoint, not from any other way,
sure. Yeah, I
essentially.
mean, you're talking about code security, right? Is your software written securely in such a way that people can't find vulnerabilities to make the software do something it's not supposed to do? So that vulnerability could exist in code that you've written. So certainly, that's not something that we do, but there's lots of great companies out there, Sneak and people, SemGrep, folks like Amplify Security. There's a lot of great companies out there that do code scanning. But there could be vulnerabilities not just in the code that you've written, but the reality is that your code is based on many underlying bits of code in libraries. So there's lots of public libraries out there, and very often there's vulnerabilities in these libraries. There's dozens of packages, dozens of these libraries per week that get backdoored or get compromised by threat actors. And when you use one of their libraries, you inherit their vulnerabilities. So there's software, there's code that you write, there's code that you bring in from third parties. Then that code lives somewhere, right? It's running on an application, could be Java or Apache or something like that. And then that's running potentially on another bit of hardware, that's running a Linux server or Windows server or some sort of customized operating system that also can have vulnerabilities. So there's been over the past 2 years, there's been a large increase in edge device vulnerabilities, where these edge devices are, it could be your public web server. So we've seen vulnerabilities in public web servers, where, for instance, you can make the public web server, essentially throw up 64K of random memory, right? So there's this vulnerability in SSL where you can make it just spit up the last, few hundred bytes or few thousand bytes that it processed. And maybe there's interesting information in there, right? No one had ever seen a vulnerability like that. All of a sudden, these web servers all across the world are just puking up data if you ask in the right way. So there's vulnerabilities in edge devices. From a vendor standpoint, right? There's the appliance makers, which is what they call specialized hardware. That specialized hardware with, in theory, specialized software, but generally it's just some underlying Linux operating system, where a vendor like Mobile Iron, Avanti, or an SSL VPN concentrator, or a firewall, ironically a firewall, or an email security gateway. These physical appliances. There's been a gigantic increase in vulnerabilities and exploitation of these vulnerabilities in the wild. And they're so successful because these edge devices that are third-party hardware, you generally don't have your security stack installed. So you're running your software, or you've purchased, a VPN from some other provider. That provider doesn't give you access to the underlying operating system. So you can't install CrowdStrike, right? You can't install SentinelOne, your EDR agent. So these vulnerabilities not just are difficult to defend against, but they're difficult to detect because you don't have your security stack on it. So yeah, like when you're talking about vulnerabilities in that are not quote unquote the user's fault, like there's been a huge uptick in these vulnerabilities because it's hard for enterprises to detect them also. And when you get on a VPN concentrator where everybody's logged in, you can see their passwords, right? You're sitting where the password exchange happens. So it's extraordinarily hard to detect because you just don't get that telemetry. The vendors are not interested in letting you install your security software on their hardware.
Wow, very interesting to learn that. So, next thing I want to ask Alex is, you mentioned reasonable versus unreasonable threats, right? Now, I kind of have an idea, I think, what it means. So I'm going to make some assumptions here. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Uh, but you also said the Bank of America example, the CEO, it said that there's no real limit on the budget when it comes to cybersecurity because you got to do what you got to do to
Mm-hmm.
protect. Now, aren't these conflicting? And here's what I mean by that, right? The reason we want to tell the difference between reasonable and unreasonable threats is because you don't want to spend money and time and resources on addressing these unreasonable threats because probably they're unlikely to happen, or even if they did happen, probably the impact is not that wide, or etc., so on and so forth. On the other side, you have the idea that there should be no limit on cybersecurity from a budgeting standpoint. So is it for companies that don't want to have that cap, you don't care for unreasonable threats, or are those not as mutually exclusive as I'm thinking?
They're not quite as um, so we focus first on detecting and protecting against the easy stuff, right? So that's do you have good cybersecurity hygiene? Are you able to respond quickly to threats that are well understood? Because the reality is that you're getting hammered all day, every day, with people hitting your firewall and they're probing, or people sending you malicious email and they're probing. And these are non-targeted threats, but just because they're not targeted at you, that doesn't mean they're not high severity. The majority of I'll just say the majority of like ransomware threats are not necessarily targeted at one organization. They're compromising everybody they can, and they're trying to figure out, are you somebody who can pay? Are you a single home user, that doesn't appear to be in a, doesn't appear to have, large amounts of resources, or are you a company that has a cyber insurance policy that, if you're a manufacturing shop or a dentist or a doctor or a construction company, would you pay me 100 grand, 200 grand, 500 grand to get your business back up and running? So the point is that even though threats aren't targeted, they can quickly become, business stoppers, with overnight. So it's not just that because it was maybe an untargeted threat that it doesn't matter, and the reverse is true too. The targeted threat activity is a much lower volume, right? It's less than 1% of the threats that you see, way less than 1%, right? Less than 1% of the threats that you see are targeted at you, but the person targeting you targeted you for a reason, right? You have something that they want. Maybe it's data or credit cards or intellectual property or whatever. They have something you want, or maybe they just don't like you. But the point is that they're not just going to stop with one attack, right? If they went through the effort of targeting you, they're going to target you with something else tomorrow that maybe you don't have as good, as good a defense against. So it's, in cyber defense, like you want to be able to characterize the threats that you're seeing to understand, what wasn't targeted at me that I stopped versus what might have been targeted at me. What was unique, because that's what I need to defend against going forward.
Okay. Let's say, I'm going to take a random, unrelated example. There are plane crashes, right? I mean, there have been planes around for, I don't know, tens of years, but still, I don't know what the frequency is. I want to say it's probably less than car accidents, but when you're flying on a plane, there is that risk that, you have your fingers crossed, you want your journey to be safe, but that could be a plane crash. Uh, to be 100% safe, you wouldn't fly. Planes would never take off. There would be no such thing as flying. But that's not feasible because people need to go places. The society has to function. So you're going to have to get on a plane and you take your chances believing that, okay, the odds of this happening are probably not, hopefully minimal. So I'm all right. So there is that ratio, right? For, I don't know what the number is for planes, like how many planes or how many miles of flying time there has to be before plane crashes happen in the last so many years. But if you took that as a fairly not the worst example, hopefully, and apply that to cybersecurity, if you wanted to be super secure, don't do any of this stuff, right? If we did nothing, obviously everything's going to be secure, but the society is going to come to a screeching halt. So you're going to have these systems in place so people can live and go about their lives. Whether it's banking, whether it's medicine, whether it's something else, you got to have these sites, front end systems, back end systems, and whatnot, right? People have to use their emails and go about their
Sure.
daily lives. Now, what is considered, I'm imagining that, you're not going to be in a situation possibly where transactions happen in the tens of hundreds of thousands and millions on a daily basis, and you go for years and nothing ever happens. Maybe it happens occasionally, but probably in a utopia. What is considered a reasonable percentage, and how do you measure that in units? Like if you took a bank, is it by the number of emails received, how many times those clicks happen, or number of transactions, or number of sessions, or number of users? And what are those units? This first part of my question, Alex. The second part of the question is, how many is considered okay, meaning you're a very secure company, yet you have so many attacks, but what should the number of those attacks be in terms of percentage for you to be actually globally acknowledged as a very secure organization? In other words, Singapore Airlines is probably one of the safest planes. So if you had to be one of the safest companies, what are the typical number of threads that you can expect to receive and still be considered a solid
Yeah,
place?
you know, that's a really hard question to answer. But I think if you maybe try to reframe it a little bit um, towards the caliber of actor you're trying to protect against, there's a certain category of threats. Um, you're thinking about like car. So maybe if you think about like car insurance versus, let's think about like health insurance versus car insurance versus volcano insurance, right? Or plane crash insurance, right? There's a certain category of actor that you are going to see all the time, and there's a certain category of tool that you need to buy to stop them. And it's an investment, and there's still stuff that's going to get through. Bad things are still going to happen, and they're going to happen, and you need to protect against it. But like at the very tip of the spear, right? There's always things that you can do to get better. If you look at some of the really the really high caliber threats, right? When we were at FireEye, right? FireEye was breached by the Russian SVR, which is like the US CIA, right? And the way that they were breached was that they compromised the SolarWinds Corporation, and the Russian SVR implanted a backdoor in SolarWinds software, and that backdoor sat there for many, many months, potentially a year. It kind of depends, but depends how you categorize it. But let's say a year. So that they were inside the SolarWinds software for many months, and the way the companies got compromised was that they were updating their SolarWinds software, and as you would update it, you would get the bad guy's code, which was embedded in the SolarWinds software. And this compromised over 10,000 organizations. So there's only one company, and those organizations were in the US government, super sensitive places in the government, many cybersecurity companies themselves, many, organizations across the globe. And one company detected it, right? It was only FireEye that actually detected it. So, if you want to detect that caliber of threat, FireEye was the number one incident response company, right? They own Mandiant. They had hundreds of threat researchers. These are the best people in the world, or certainly the best in the private sector at stopping cyber threats. So if you want to stop that once in a generation threat, right, the level of investment that you need, everything is doable. Clearly, FireEye did it. Everything is defendable. But at some point, most organizations who don't have the best talent in the world, they need to make reasonable trade-offs about, okay, I know that some things are going to get in, and what layered defenses can I put in place that maybe I can't stop it, but at least I can detect it. Or if I can't detect it, at least I can stop it when they're trying to move laterally in my organization. Or if I can't stop it when they're moving laterally, at least when they touch the data I really care about, I need to be able to detect that. Or if I can't detect that, I need to be able to figure out if they copy that outside of the network, or if they actually read the documents. Some people put these cool honey tokens inside sensitive documents, and there's this great company, Thinkus Canary. I'm not involved with them or anything, but a great company where you can embed little tokens inside Word documents or inside your email or inside your network. And if somebody were to take this document and open it, your little canary fires, right? So it's only going to trigger if somebody opens a document. So you might slip in, one of these documents in your document stores. And the idea is that if somebody manages to take it and they manage to open it, you got a big problem, right? You missed steps 1 through 10 in the attack chain. So, it's really a function of like how, what type of threat actor are you going to reasonably be able to protect yourself against? And what things are just going to be, a little bit unreasonable based on the investment you're able to make, which is how much your board is willing to give you, for cybersecurity.
Those are really interesting. Everything you say is super interesting to me as I learn this, and I'm sure the audience as well. Uh, I have a few other things to ask you. Do you have about 15, 20
Sure.
minutes, Alex? Okay. Um, so probably you can keep your answers as short as you can, so I can ask a lot more questions as well. But I really appreciate everything you're sharing here. As a developer or as an architect, as somebody running a company, right? If you asked me, not knowing anywhere near the amount of information that you have and you know, I'm going to say to keep things secure, I'm going to have to build fewer features, right? I'm going to, you know what, let's say we are doing 8 APIs, or as we build APIs as a company, the lesser we do, the fewer features we have, the lesser threats are going to be. In other words, we can, if we maintain what we have and made some improvements gradually, linearly, not exponentially, the chances of introducing more vulnerabilities is going to be lesser, right? Just the way life and math works. But as a company, we can't afford to do that, because to satisfy or appease the market, you're going to have to keep building more and more as quickly as you possibly can. And with AI in the mix of things, you're going to have to do that 10 times faster or 20 times faster. So, where do you generally see companies draw that line? I know it's a very generic question, Alex, but I just want to get your thoughts on. Hey, don't build 25 features, build like 16 of them, so you'll have fewer threats, or build all 25 but spend more money. How is it? Look, it sounds to me like there's art and science involved. How do you maneuver that essentially when you talk to clients or engaging in cybersecurity and investing in it?
It's a really good question, and my snippy answer is that developers don't care about security. So while it's a nice thing to think about, like, oh yeah, we can have 5 features and do 5 super securely, or we can have 100 features and security. The developer, they're gonna
Pick
build up
100.
and I'm mostly joking. But the reality is, security, secure code reviews, either automated or manual used to be a gigantic like time suck, and like by definition you're telling the developer they did something wrong. You're slowing them down, you're making them go through like multiple development cycles. You're a brake on engineering. You're not an enabler, you're a cost center. So there was traditionally a lot of friction between code scanning and developers, and that's one of the areas that AI is actually doing a significantly better job of automating code reviews. Previously the tools were really not immature, but the technology just didn't exist to have super high fidelity code security that would happen. By fidelity, I mean detecting it without massive false positives. Right? Anybody can detect things, but that knob between generating a lot of alerts and having a lot of false positives, or generating very few alerts and hoping them, making sure they're accurate. Code security tools until the last few years were really more the former. Like they had a lot of false positives, and that's one of the big benefits of LLMs, is the ability to understand what vulnerabilities look like based on the whole corpus of the entire world of insecure code, and of publicly documented vulnerabilities. So that has definitely shifted with some of those great code scanning type companies I mentioned, the Sneaks and the Amplifies and the SemGreps and folks like that. So that has changed in the past 2 years. Just code is getting significantly better, but also very similar tools are exposing insecure code at a frightening pace, where these LLMs, these AI models, are able to churn through this legacy code that hasn't been audited in a long time, and they're able to find vulnerabilities in software at a pace that's incredible. It is significantly easier now to find vulnerabilities in code base, and you're seeing that. I think you're seeing that. You're certainly seeing the public research back that up, but you will start to see the private, the actual usages of these vulnerabilities increase, in the next months and years.
Okay. You mentioned AI and LLM, so it's a good time for me to ask this question. We talked about a number of different kinds of vulnerabilities. We talked about industries. We mentioned that There are vulnerabilities specific to industries or agnostic to them, where it's generic across industries. And you mentioned potential bad actors, right? You talked about Russia, a little bit North Korea, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of data available, right? A lot of data available, good data
Mhm.
as well. So when you have good data and good models, and with companies like Anthropic and Claude and whatnot, uh, there's a lot of good decisions can be made by these models once they are trained, and by training and inference and whatnot. So a lot of these can hopefully be detected before bad things happen, or even if they did go undetected, maybe there's a way to recover from those vulnerabilities because of, again, good data and models and LLMs and whatnot. Now, given that, right, given that there's rich data available, probably a lot of data in this space, what does it mean in the future, in the next 6 to 12 months, Alex? Do you see, in terms of people working in the space of cybersecurity, do you see that fewer people, fewer cybersecurity engineers are needed because now AI is able to make great decisions based on the richness and the breadth of data available? Or do you see the number of engineers, cybersecurity engineers, stay almost the same, just being able to protect more and doing a lot more? Or on the other end of the spectrum, do you actually see the need for more cybersecurity engineers because as more people are building software primarily and predominantly using AI, there is room for even more vulnerability than before because fewer humans are involved? Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, but then you see the number of engineers, cybersecurity engineers, and the need for them grow. Where do you think we're going to be in the next 6 to 12 months?
So where we are today is that AI is freeing up, you know, cybersecurity professionals to investigate threats that would have been totally missed before. So the reality is that in a SOC, there's huge categories, huge amounts of alerts being generated. And in theory, alerts should be known bad, right? There's huge numbers of known bad threats, of alerts that are getting generated by tools that you pay money for. These alerts are getting generated and they're getting ignored. And they're getting ignored because the false positive rate, they're getting ignored because you kind of trust that the device did what it said it did. Oh, I said I blocked this thing. Like, let's make sure it actually got blocked. So there's these whole like low severity, medium severity alerts that in most SOCs just go straight to the trash. Like they just don't get looked at. The only thing that gets looked at is critical or highs. So all those people, all the automated triage that companies like StrikeReady and similar companies can do. Hey, I'm going to triage this email for you. I'm going to triage this endpoint investigation, this identity-based alert. When you don't have to copy and paste that data from this form to that form, from this tool to that tool, when all of that is just like, go do these 10 queries, do this federated search across my stack, pull the data back in, LLM summarize it, figure out if it's real or not. It frees up those analysts to look at the other, what might be noise in their environment, these low severity alerts, to really do those deep investigations when that might have been missed. But I think you're right. And the second part of your question is, will this lead to more need for cybersecurity professionals? The complexity and the volume and the sophistication of attacks is always increasing. And that's kind of an easy throwaway line, but the reality is that AI is up leveling defenders. Like if you were a one, AI is making you a five. If you were a three, you might be a nine. So it's giving people the ability to discover new vulnerabilities. O days, right? 0 days, used to be only a tool that governments or highly skilled threat actors had, whether they were criminal or nation state espionage. And I think it's probably too early to say, oh, everybody's going to have 0 day vulnerabilities. But from what I've seen, it is certainly plausible that vulnerabilities are going to be easier to discover um, in broadly distributed code bases, in these libraries like that we've talked about. And so we've seen targeted threat actors really embed themselves in some of these libraries, right, that get invoked by all sorts of tools and sit there for months or years. that they could be implanting backdoors that aren't going to be activated for many years in code bases that get distributed all around the world. So I think that there's going to be a spike and then hopefully a leveling out as I don't want to say all the vulnerabilities are from the past are discovered, but that's kind of what we typically see in cybersecurity, right? Somebody has some new class of vulnerability, and then everyone goes back and looks and say, "Oh, boy, this class of vulnerability, whether it was XSS attacks or cross-site scripting, or whether it was SQL injection type attacks, or there's all these like categories of exploitation. Somebody realizes, oh, this whole thing exists, and then they go back and look, and this has been around for 30 years. I think that we're going to see an explosion of that, of new vulnerabilities that are getting discovered, and they will eventually be patched, right? AI will help you do the patching also, but I think that there's going to be an explosion. There's an explosion in threat actors, an explosion in volume. If you think about, okay, I'm going to target you, Krish, right? I'm going to write you an email, and I'm going to do a whole bunch of research, and I'm going to figure out where you live, DC metro area. I'm going to figure out what other podcasts you've run. I'm going to figure out, your family, probably maybe grab your address. It's going to take me a long time to like figure out who you are, tailor an email that might be interesting to you, maybe craft a malicious PDF or something, set up that whole infrastructure, get a domain, set up an infrastructure on Cloudflare workers or on Versal or one of these services. Like this is like hours of work to target you, right? And now it's seconds or a minute of all the deep research about you and all the ability, let's say, to set up an email conversation tool where I'm going to actually have a conversation with you for, and I've seen this, a super high, doesn't matter who, conversation for a month and a half. And then they send you something malicious, right? After they've gone back and forth with you 10 times. Like the ability to automate that is scary. It's super effective, and it's really hard to tell, over email if you're conversing over the period of days, weeks, months with a bot or a person. So we're going to see an explosion for sure, and I think that it will lead. I hope that it will lead to more humans, more butts in seats to counter these threats.
Those are amazingly specific examples there. So, really appreciate that, Alex. We've got about 10 minutes to go. So, for all of these questions, if you could just keep your response to like under a minute so I can ask as many
Okay.
as I can. Yep. Yep. So, the first one, again, these are random ones as well, right? You, how much, what percentage of these threats from what you've seen happen to be from outside the country, right? We're talking about North Korea, we're talking about Russia. Let's say you could close the borders, the virtual borders, quote unquote, right?
Mhm.
Theoretically, how does it cut the number of threats by? Are we talking it's down by 90% or is it down by 25%? And I know these are ballpark numbers. I'm just trying to get in a sense for how much of this threat is coming from outside our borders versus just within our border.
Yeah, it kind of depends how you define that. Like, if you mean that logically, like where the threat actor actually is versus where the attack originates from. The vast majority of I don't want to speak out of turn, but it is a very very common thing that the threat actors will purchase a server somewhere geographically close to you, or they'll compromise a machine somewhere geographically close to you, or there's massive botnets, what they call operational relay boxes, orbs, which are gigantic networks of compromised home machines or compromised any devices, right? It could be a smart device or there's large botnets like that. And the only thing that they're doing is leveraging these services as proxy nodes to evade any sort of country-based detection. Like, hey, somebody just logged in from Russia with my account. Like, that's probably bad, right? If they log in from Nigeria, that's probably bad. That stuff still does happen, but um, with any level of sophistication, and it's not even sophistication, with any motivation by a threat actor, it's coming from somewhere geographically near you. So the whole notion of it doesn't really
But the,
work.
but but the threat actors themselves, I know you're saying that the servers might be located in
Mhm.
our country, but if the threat actors themselves are generally at the outside, in other words, most of the threat is it coming from humans or intentions like outside our borders is what I'm
Yeah,
sensing here, right?
by our, if you mean America, like the
Right.
majority of threats against corporations exist from actors outside our country. No, certainly not every attack. There's
Wow.
lots of
Okay.
threat actors inside the organization that are malicious insiders, that are kids, that are criminals, that are organized crime, one-off board high school kids. There's certainly, America,
Yeah, no, but I get the
America
idea, right? No, that certainly.
at its finest. We we have the best and the worst. But
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of the actual volumes of the typical threats that corporations see, the majority of it is from Eastern Europe, ex like Soviet bloc countries, Russia, China themselves. Vietnam has a large contingent. Nigeria has a large number of scammers. So yeah, certainly the majority of the actors are from outside the country.
And then if people here, I've read some articles and seen some videos on YouTube where, there are these kinds of bad actors who particularly target senior citizens, right? People who are probably not as familiar with cybercrime and whatnot. If Just really quick, if we were to be able to educate people in our country, right, just to say, hey, these are the types of things. I know these things keep changing and there's no
Yeah.
end to it, but is there an education that can be done here that's possible, Alex, that you see which will actually minimize the number of such bad things that end up happening? Is it people's ignorance that's also lending a lot of room here for such bad things to happen?
No. So if I were to ever quit my job, it would be to start a company to prevent elder abuse like this. The scale is breathtaking. I mean, these are trusting. I mean, think of your grandparents, right? These are sweet, trusting people,
Yeah,
and the level of scam, especially in the deep fake world, is. I mean, if you think a typical corporate user has a hard enough time figuring out if their boss is truly their boss on the phone. I mean, it is. I don't want to say it's an unsolvable problem, uh, but
it's difficult.
there's no
Yeah.
magic bullet that I've seen yet to stop the level of theft from elders in this country, and it's really sad. The only thing that I would say is to you certainly don't want to take away people's agency, right? But having some sort of a nanny like tool that you might put on your kid's device that's able to see who they're talking to on Facebook Messenger or text messages that they're responding to or bank transactions that they're doing. It breaks my heart the level of abuse that happens.
Totally right. And I mentioned elders and seniors there, but the other end of that spectrum is our younger people like Gen Z. If I remember correctly, I saw something on Jimmy Kimmel not too long ago where it was like, they stopping these young adults or even I don't know in the teens and whatnot, right? And they asked them, hey, what do you think about passwords? I'm vaguely recollecting this snippet there. Is quite funny, but sadly funny too. What is your password, right? She goes, I think the girl said it was my cat or when the cat was born or something along those lines. And 30 seconds later the question's, hey, what's the name of your cat? And then she says the name of the cat. And another 30 seconds later, when did you buy the cat? And there's this date there. So this was somebody who's not 80 years old, right, but it's actually 18 years old. So it's hard to educate somebody, not impossible, but as you grow older, you're not used to a number of these things. But is there a problem on this side as well, Alex, where people who are young are also super vulnerable that they end up giving social security numbers to buy a cup of coffee? And I read something where somebody wanted to buy coffee and the guy is like trying to mess with that person, says, hey, can you give me a social? And the kid is like, the boy is like ready to blurt out the social to buy a cup of coffee, right? Which seemed almost preposterous and unimaginable, but it seems to be happening all the time. So what do we do there?
Um, Yeah, so I mean the threats against children are generally of a different scale. Obviously, kids don't have a lot of money to steal, so your identity certainly gets stolen all the time, and that's terrible. They could open up a credit card in your name or something, but the reality is like the scale of financial loss of a teen is not very high. The threats against teens and children, are obviously the story. And not, I worked at Facebook for a time in security, and the threats, you know, 2 billion people on Facebook, right? If you want to do something bad, you can blend in with 2 billion people, no matter how much Facebook invests to try to stop this, right? Yeah, sure, they could always do more. They could always hire more people, but that's just an unfortunate reality when you run a platform with 2 billion people. So the threats against children are very difficult to see. What threat actors are able to do, and many of these are Westerners. These are people in the U.S. or in the U.K. in particular that are targeting children on social media for fun, and it's very hard. And again, the only the there's not a good technical defense against this. The only defense is a nanny like tool where parents can monitor what's happening on social media, on Roblox, right, on anywhere where you can get a direct message, because that abuse is the worst out of anything that I've seen in my career, is the crimes against children, and specifically how little you can actually do to stop it. Right, it's hard to stop unless you turn off messaging. Right, it's hard.
I've come to the last two questions for you, and I'll give you an opportunity to ask me anything you want to ask me as well, Alex. The last but one question is, so let's say I'll take an example of banks or banking systems in India, right? I mean, my parents live in India, and I am not too familiar, uh, reasonably familiar with the interaction that they have with the banking platforms. The one thing that I've noticed, I'll even take the example. I think it was OCBC, which is a bank. It's a Chinese national bank, I think, but it's in South Asia and Southeast Asia and stuff, in Singapore and Malaysia and whatnot. If you try to, let's say, do a money transfer, right? Let's say I'm transferring $100 to Alex through that app. When I was trying to help my parents, I was amused, and I'm like, you know what? I couldn't use this thing because it drove me crazy and nuts. Here is why it is: to do the transfer, I don't remember the exact sequence of things, Alex, but the number of things I had to do in terms of the two-factor auth. And once I get the two-factor auth, I need to have it. There needs to be a second login. You log in as a second person to do the approval of the transfer, and they get a notification. And then there's a code that pops up on the screen, the 6 digits. You need to take it to the phone, and then you enter it. You only have 30 seconds to do it. I mean, forget security, right? You've got to be like one of this Matt Damon and, like, I don't know, like Bone Supremacy to get this transfer done, because if you're not quick enough, you wouldn't meet this 30 seconds, and then you go back to square one, and they give you three chances, and then that's it. You're logged out for
Yeah.
a day, right? This drove me nuts to the point that I was like, you know what? This thing probably is very secure, but it's so secure that's unusable that I probably don't even want to use this thing. And then we have the other side of the spectrum here in the US, where doing a transfer, it's like when you go to a restaurant in America, people take your credit card and then you get it like 10 minutes later. God knows what anybody's doing with it. And you travel to Europe, you appreciate that nobody ever touches your card. They bring the device to the table, right? So we spend so much money on cybersecurity as a country. We are so advanced. We're leading the world in terms of AI and stuff. Yet, there are these differences. But my question really there was, Alex, can these systems become so secure to the point that people don't want to use it? Or my question really to you is, I see a country like India where there's a lot of engineering and a lot of progress, but they have like 10 checks before you do something, or OCBC, Southeast Asia. Why do you think those systems might be like that? Or why do we not have systems like that? Is our approach to security very different from what other people in other parts of the world might have?
Um, so yeah, so there's a lot in there. But yeah, so in terms of authentication, they're constantly making things more secure, and they're trying to make it less intrusive, right? So username and password, and then you had username and password and a token, a physical token you'd carry around. Username and password. Okay, now we're going to send you a text. Oh no, the bad guys can read your text messages, so we're going to install a one-time token type tool like Google Authenticator. Okay, that's not good. Okay, we're going to do pass keys now, which is like, kind of a hardware or software based key that lives on your thing and you can authenticate using biometrics. And it's certainly, you know, maybe passkeys are truly going to solve all these problems for you. Um, but I'm not optimistic that it won't be bypassed by some other type of technology. Of course, on the flip side, you have Bitcoin, right? If you want to have you want to buy Bitcoin, you want to send it to somebody, boom, you can do it. Sure, they say your gun, your foot, right? And I think a lot of that comes back to who is going to be responsible for fraud and for mistakes, right? If you send your Bitcoin to somebody, good luck. You can't get it back. It's gone, right? It's over. In America, you talk about people take your credit card, and that was definitely true, maybe more true in the past. But the reason why that worked is because consumers weren't responsible for fraud, right? If there was fraud against your card, you were not responsible, and the merchant was not responsible, right? It was eaten by the credit card companies, which is why there was a shift towards a chip. They changed the rules so that if you were the merchant and there was fraud from the mag stripe, then the merchant or the payment processor, kind of depends, would be responsible for the fraud. But if you had the chip, you wouldn't be responsible. So I'm not sure in other countries, but a lot of it has to do with liability, with who's going to cover the fraud. Because in America you don't want to stop people from spending, right? You don't want to slow down spending. But now we have this Bitcoin system, cryptocurrency, and all these people, when they lose their money, when they get hacked, because it turns out they don't have bank security to kind of bring it back to the front. You might have a strong password, but a guy shows up to your house with a crowbar, and you're going to give him your Bitcoin. That's just how it is, right? And then you're gonna throw up your hands and say, "Where was J.P. Morgan to protect me?" Right? I don't think so, man. Like, it's gone. So we're trying it both ways in this country too. So we'll see what wins in the end. But I wouldn't want to hold cryptocurrency. I mean, you show up with a crowbar, like it's over. See, I want
You know,
Mr. Morgan to have you know.
thank you for sharing your thoughts with that one specifically. My last question is about food, but before I ask you that simple or hard question, do you have any questions for me,
No,
Alex?
I mean, you've interviewed lots of people. Who was the most interesting guest, except for me, of course? That you've
That's a broad question. I can maybe
One
even
who sticks in your
answer
head.
after the
No, there's one
podcast.
person who sticks in your head. Who's that one person?
Here's what I would say, right? Every guest is different. I mean, this is not a cliched answer, I promise you. Every guest is different in terms of their backgrounds and what they actually like to talk about and also what they do. Many times it's the same thing. They like to talk about what they do, but there are several occasions where the guest is doing something for a living, but they have an interest in something else that's probably related or maybe even unrelated to the topic. So the excitement I have is the fact that I'm able to have this conversation and learn plentiful, much like from yourself, and our audience is able to appreciate that as well. But two, the challenge in understanding what the guest the speaker has been doing or working on. And sometimes it's very different from what I would be doing on a daily basis, right? Like I'm not spending any time specifically on cybersecurity. Hopefully we build systems that are secure and use tools and frameworks and libraries that are secure. But I wouldn't, no, I have no experience with the security operations center or any of those things that you mentioned. So just being able to discover, even in that industry, right? Living and building software for 25 years, you recognize that every single day that there are so many things that you have little knowledge about. There are so many things you have absolutely no knowledge about, and there are plenty of things that you have some knowledge about that are actually not so accurate or may have changed. And being able to constantly be willing to adapt to those learnings is what I particularly enjoy. It's less about a guest. I appreciate every guest is showing up here, obviously, but it's more how I'm able to take away from what they're able to share during the 1 hour there. I didn't intend to make it a long-winded non-answer, but that's my genuine answer to your question. If some part of it at least
Okay,
makes
sure.
sense, yeah. Anything else that you want to ask me?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, which means brings me to my very last question. what would be your ideal dinner? Let's say you could spend any amount of money and eat anything that you want to be able to eat. What would be that cuisine? And maybe you can tell us what the appetizer, the entree, and the dessert might look like, one or all of it. But what would be your nice, relaxing, enjoyable dinner?
Huh. That's that's a great question. Um, these days, I've got to go with probably a steak frites, right? Steak, chimichurri sauce, extra chimichurri, extra flavoring, and some French fries. I think that is if I had one meal right now, that's what I want right now when I go on.
So I know the steak part, but you said steak frites. You
Yeah,
said
steak frites,
steak
yeah. So it's
frites.
a slightly fattier cut, a little more gristle, um, thin fries, and yeah, with a chimichurri on top.
Some of our audience is in
Mhm.
India, um, and they might definitely, I'm just, I'm, just, I come from the part of the world where I guess, it's kind of funny for what it's
Mhm.
worth, Alex. India exports a ton of beef. They're one of the largest exporters of
Ironically,
beef. But but when you talk about eating it in the country, that's a very strangely
sure.
sensitive topic. I don't know why I felt like I should mention that, but I'm just saying it for what it's worth.
You
But
know what I
it's
love about traveling in India is that maybe the first time maybe a little concerned of that maybe 50% of the country is vegetarian or something like that.
You've been to India, Alex?
Sure.
Have you
Oh yeah,
been
of
to India?
course. And so, oh, I don't know, I'm not going to really be eating meat. You don't even notice. The vegetarian food is so good that you don't even notice you're not eating chicken or pork or beef or something. It's just
You know,
incredible.
it's fun. It's funny you should say that. One of my favorite TV personalities, unfortunately, he's no more. Uh, you know,
You gonna say
uh,
you
he
say
had
Anthony
said,
Bourdain? Who are
sorry.
you?
Yeah, I was going to say, yep, Anthony
One of my favorites.
Bourdain. Yep. I really miss him. Every time I think about Anthony Bourdain, I can't come to terms with him not being around. But he had been to Kerala, which is a southern state in India. And I think I come from the neighboring state, Tamil Nadu. He mentioned he goes, and this is one of his first trips to India. He has something and he goes, "Oh my God." I think I'm paraphrasing what he said, but it's exactly what you said there, Alex. He said, "If only I knew vegetarian food could be this good, then I probably would have eaten a lot more of this," right? So yeah, India's got some incredibly good vegetarian food for
Absolutely.
sure. I think that's all I have. Just hang on after we end this year, folks. Thanks to Alex Lanstein for taking time. Alex, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation here. Alex is the CTO of Strike Ready, an AI-powered security operations center. As someone who knows very little about cybersecurity. I've learned a ton in the last 45 minutes or about an hour or so, and I'm pretty sure our audience has as well. Any closing comments, Alex, before we call it wraps?
I don't think so. StrikeReady.com. If you're looking to automate your security operations center, alert triage, vulnerability prioritization, threat intel operationalization. If you don't know how to do it, we'll help you. We'll help you operationalize it in your SOC.
Thank you. Thanks,
Awesome.
Alex. Yep.